And could you just start out by giving me a biographical sketch, kind of who you are, where you came from, what you've done, what you're doing now, and you can be as elaborate or not as you'd like.
Okay, I am a journalist and educator. I came to New York about 12 years ago. I was born in India, where my family's from. Soon after I was born, we moved to Australia, where I grew up in Sydney. And when I was 20, I left Australia and started traveling and working in Latin America. And somehow ended up in New York and was already doing radio journalism throughout Latin America, filing for the BBC and the ABC. And then I came to New York and got involved with community radio here with WBAI, and have been part of the Pacifica community, producer, reporter, host, and started an organization where we train people, community folks, high school students, people who really are not represented in the ranks of journalism, to be media makers. Mm-hmm. And that has grown into an organization called People's Production House, and this year we turned 10 years old. And I think, kind of as with the country, it's an exciting time for us as well.
Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about your initial introduction to journalism, how you got into that in the first place, and then also you said somehow you ended up in Latin America, which there's probably a lot kind of laying behind the word somehow, but what I'm really interested in is the kind of the relationship between your moving into journalism as a path, but also your kind of coming to consciousness politically. What's the relationship between those two things?
Great question. So I I was raised Catholic and grew up in a very homogenous community. And we lived in like a beachside community in Sydney. We were one of the only immigrant families.
How old were you when you went to Sydney?
Less than a year old.
Oh, okay. So you really grew up in Australia.
I grew up in Australia. Okay. We went back to India frequently, a couple of years to visit our grandparents and family, but grew up in Australia. Sydney is a very different place when I was growing up, where you really only could practice your culture behind your closed doors. So we were very Indian behind our closed doors, but the minute we stepped outside, I think I really did grow up believing I was a good little white Australian girl. And I don't think I ever really realized that there were all these other parts to me culturally. And when I graduated from high school, which was an all-girls school, it was a Catholic school, I don't think I even really knew what being gay or lesbian was about. I just did the next natural thing and applied for university, which seemed like an extension of high school, and I ended up at a university in a communications program that was majority gay and lesbian. Mm-hmm. And it was a real awakening of just like, whoa, where am I? I chose to do a major in Aboriginal studies, and I had grown up with a very close friend who was Aboriginal. We played cricket together, but never really knew much at all about the struggle of Aboriginal people. Learned the white Australian history version of it and believed it. Mm-hmm. And got to university and just had all these things shatter my world. My very kind of white, Catholic, homogenous world. Mm-hmm. And my sister was very politically active at the time. She was a little older than me. I think she was trying to educate me. I was I rejected that a lot because you can't learn from your older sister, when of course I clearly had a lot to learn from my older sister. She was a member actually of a Trotskyist party, and in her own way was really trying to help me see the light. And so that was kind of a collusion of a lot of things happening post high school. And with my best friend at the time, we just really wanted to travel. And and I think part of that was realizing that a lot of the community that I'd grown up with, my high school friends, didn't actually have that much in common with them, because I was beginning to see the world in different ways and to understand the struggle of Aboriginal people, and that you don't celebrate the day in which colonization happened. In fact, Aboriginal people are celebrating that they're still surviving, and that's just a whole different concept. So slowly I'm beginning to come to see these issues, and so but there's a real clash going on. So anyway, we decided to leave to travel in Latin America, and one of my high school teachers had given me an Isabel Allende book a while ago and said, I think you'll really like this book. And it had just kind of triggered this imaginary place for me that was the entire of Latin America. But then my sister gave me Angela Davis's autobiography to read, and it was, I think that was part of her, like, gosh, let me just like try and educate this
right.
little sister of mine. She's only 15 months older, but
wow.
I was the cheerleader, and I was the one who like went out to nightclubs and got drunk, and just the things that she really could see that I needed some like some guidance, and so she gave me, like, one of the things she gave me to read was Angela Davis's autobiography, and it just like was like this, it just opened a door in my head. And there's the one scene in it which I still today remember so clearly is Angela Davis in Cuba, in the fields, working. And it just, the picture that Angela Davis painted in that book of Cuba just seemed like, wow, what an amazing society. Like, I had not read any Marx or Engels, I hadn't read any, it just seemed like, whoa, imagine if you could live in a society like that. Like, that's just what lodged in my head. And I need to go to Cuba. I need to go see this for myself. Like, I'm not going to believe what anybody tells me. I need to go see it for myself, at age like 19. But I also clearly knew they don't speak English in Cuba. I need to learn Spanish. So when my best friend and I were like, okay, we need to like figure out getting out of Australia, let's go to Latin America. They speak Spanish there. We can, like, with our no Spanish whatsoever, we'll be fine. And so that just, we took a year off university and saved and saved and saved and saved and saved and went over. And I think that was really the start of my political education. In many different ways, like just seeing, and I've spent a lot of time in India and seen incredible poverty, but never registered in the way of people actually organize against these things, and they struggle, and they know what's best for their families and their children, and they'll put forward solutions. They're not people to be pitied, and et cetera, et cetera. And I began to really see that in Latin America, like up close. And it was kind of, I think it was just, as each day you'd learn a little more, you'd see something else that shocked you or saddened you or made you question who you were. And also then, running into different people who would give me different things to read. And so I think that was really where I started to get some kind of real politicization.
You talk about growing up as you said, the typical white Australian girl, which you say with some irony, although I sense that maybe you didn't experience it with any irony at the time. How does your own immigrant status in Australia play into any of these kinds of searchings and questionings that you were engaged with at the time? Or, thinking ahead to the kind of work that you've moved into later.
We always knew we were kind of other and outsiders. But we had a large family. Both my parents have 6 siblings each, so we had a lot of cousins, and most of them lived in Sydney. So we had a very safe, community to grow up in.
Was there a larger Indian community there, aside from your huge family?
Yes, there was, but we didn't so much interact with the larger Indian community. It was mainly just our family because there was enough of us. So, and our cousins were in the same situation as us. And so we all grew up together and we were very tight. And I think that, to a large degree, helped offset a lot of the things that were, kind of alien outside of that. I would say I had a great childhood. Like, I don't feel at all like I was, I think as I grew older, I realized that it's okay to be proud of being Indian and to celebrate that, and to invite your friends over when your mum's cooking this food that makes the whole street smell. For the most part, that's really embarrassing because everybody comments on that and they know that you're like that. But then you start to realize, well, actually, that's not something to be embarrassed. So those kinds of things, but I don't feel like it's any big woe story by any means. But, we definitely, like, my grandparents were denied they had most of their children in Australia, and they kept, they kept getting denied the ability to stay in Australia. And they were old, they couldn't live in India. They actually did have what we would imagine in the US was the equivalent of a deportation order sent to them many times. They finally ended up leaving the country to go back to India. They had a horrible time. And my mother was always fighting it, writing letters, calling elected officials, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time, actually, when I was starting 7th grade, starting high school, there was a really big anti-Asian sentiment in Australia because more Asians were coming into Australia. We always grew up thinking that, we're Asian, not necessarily South Asian as the identity is understood here in America. And, in class, we'd sit there and the teacher, like on say, like the current affairs program on the nightly news, there'd be call-in polls. Should all Asians go home? Call this number yes, call this number no, right? And while I knew that quite maybe wasn't me, like they were really talking about another type of Asian, it still stung really deep because people were calling in, yes, they should all go home. And then the next day in school, the teacher would talk about it, and like one girl would put up her hand and be like, my parents called in like 25 times and said, yes, all Asians should go home. And I'd kind of be like, I'm Asian, should I go home? And people would be like, you're not Asian, you're Indian. As if like, that's okay. You kind of look like us, you're just dark-skinned. But so it was just very confusing, and, you always knew you were an outsider and another, never completely accepted. And, I was kind of part of a geeky group. It was never like, anyway. But by the same token...
So then when was it that you came to the U.S.?
When I was 21, I think.
And what were the circumstances there? Just more travel, or did you come intending to stay?
No, I was working in Ecuador with an indigenous filmmaker. I had been in Ecuador a while and had met him, and I was doing radio and sound stuff at the time, and he had just gotten this grant to make this, he's indigenous, to make this film on the 26 indigenous communities, and he hired me to be his like sound recordist, which to this day is the best job I've ever had, and it was my first job ever in life, and or my first real job besides all the waiting tables and working at the bodega type equivalents in Australia. He hired me. I spent like a good 6 months. Like I'd go out to these really remote communities to do kind of pre-production and set up the shoot, and then call the crew, and they'd come out from Quito, and then we'd do the shoot. And it ended not in a great way. I was young and didn't realize a lot of the ways of the world, and was very much taken advantage of, and then got to a place where I just literally had to escape. And this was like back pre 9/11, flew to New York on somebody else's ticket. Anyway, I just can't even believe I would do that now, but got to New York and had an extended family here who took me in, and I was just kind of in this state of like, what do I do? I should just go back to Australia. And like my dad was great at that time in Sydney. He was just like, just stick it out. You've had such an amazing, just like, you don't want to come home on a low note. Like, see if you can stick it out. And it was really good advice.
I'm curious about, you've talked about your sister's politics, and I know something of your politics. What about your parents' politics? I mean, how did they look at the world, and what were they encouraging you to do during these years?
Well, not that we knew at the time, but my father, I guess he's kind of like a closet socialist. He never really, he was busy working, and my mum was very Catholic, raised us very Catholic. So she, I think she's learnt along with us. She's come to politicization along with us. My dad, very politically savvy, very wise, he just never really pushed it on us. And he never came to church with us. He never practiced. He's more definitely an atheist, even though he was raised Catholic. He just, interestingly, with my sister first and then me, both kind of started to question this very Catholic upbringing and what the church was trying to tell us, and just moved in a much more politically left direction. And that brought us closer to him, realizing that he shared a lot of these, and so.
Okay, so you're in New York. When does it first occur to you that you might be here for a while, that maybe in fact you're going to stay here? And what were your first political engagements? Because eventually you become, quite active in...
Well, I went really early. I mean, within, I'd say weeks of coming, I went to WBAI, which is politically very left.
And just assuming that with your background in sound, you'd be able to do something
well,
there.
I had been doing some pieces in Latin America, and they were increasingly getting more political, and then increasingly the BBC started rejecting them more. And so I had all this great sound.
I assume there's a relationship between those two things.
Yes, as I was, and it's funny because now I can look back on it, and I was definitely very, a lot, just like when you first start to see that light, you just like, whew, like there is no other way. It is this way. And so Americans who I was meeting in Latin America and was talking to about what I was doing, various people would say, oh, there's this great program in New York called Our Americas, and this guy called Mario Murillo does it, and you should send him your stuff. And I was like, cool. And I did it, and he took it. Of course, I never got paid. And I was just like, but hang on, I need to get paid for this stuff. And then soon I realized, well, at least someone wants to listen. So I hooked up with, just various, I was able to send various little bits and pieces of radio. And then when I came to New York, I was like, let me go meet this Mario guy who took my radio and never paid me for it. And I walked, and he was like, yeah, come meet me. I'll be at the studio on such and such day. And I walked in to meet him, and he was like, hey, want to do this show with me? And there it was, literally within a week of getting to New York, I was producing with him and co-hosting with him. And so yeah, and then I was in New York for about 6 months, and my visa ended, a tourist visa. And so and by that point I was just juiced again to New York had just seemed like this amazing place where you could do so many different things. And I'd learned some basic Spanish, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to go to Cuba. So I went to Cuba. I was there for about 10 months. And then was getting told by my university in Australia, if you don't come back and finish, we are not going to let you finish, even though I had done some subjects at the University of Havana that I was trying to get them to credit, but they really they credited some, and then they were like, no, you've got to come back and at least do one semester. So that was why I had to leave. And went back to Australia for a few months. But in the meantime, I had kind of met my partner in New York and just wanted to be back in New York. And so finished school, came back, and never left.
I want to talk about this current historical moment that we're in, and there are many different ways we could define that, and I'll kind of let you define it. But first, since I know that you've written about immigration and you've done a lot of work around the issue, here we are, 2 or 3 days after this extraordinary bill was just passed in Arizona, basically making it potentially illegal to be Latino. I'd love to hear kind of your initial take on what's going on right now around the politics of immigration, and especially in Arizona, but not exclusively.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hold much hope under an Obama administration that things... I think the work that I've done around immigration has led me to understand that it's going to take a generation before we get to a place where immigration is not understood in a framework of criminal justice or criminality or something that needs to be policed. And I think many people don't remember a time when it wasn't like that, but it really wasn't like that. The 80s was a great time in some ways, especially for asylum seekers, where I think there were more enlightened minds leading immigration policy, and so human rights workers and advocates were being hired as asylum officers, and the goals were not to find people out as trying to trick their way into America. It was actually to help find a place for people who were true victims of persecution, right? And maybe it's a matter of semantics, but when you talk to people who worked in the immigration system in the 80s, you just get such a different feel for how the nation, and it's of course gone in waves. I think we all know America's immigration history locked up all sorts of groups at all different times. But I think there are periods in America's history where we can look at that were more enlightened. You wouldn't even think of putting people in jail, immigrants in jail. Like if you came here and made an asylum case and were denied, it's just such almost a no-brainer now. Like it's not even questioned that you should sit in jail while you wait deportation because you might escape. You might go out into the community. And I think that's the kind of mindset that no matter what an Obama administration wanted to do, but honestly, when you look at it, breaking it down by policy, nothing's really going to change. Like he might be outspoken about what happened in Arizona, but it kind of doesn't mean much when he's also having secret policies like this secure communities that we can't even get information on, that you have to sue. The Center for Constitutional Rights is suing to get information on, which likely will just lead to a massive increase in deportations. I think it's going to take a generation of and I don't even feel like we're there, not with this administration, leadership on the issue to get us back to a place where immigrants are. I don't even want to say like a good or a positive thing because that puts like some value judgment on a person, but a fact of life anyway.
Yeah. A kind of neutral product of the political economy or something like that.
Yeah, just like when we're not making these like. I feel like it's the place where we're at is that we have extremists writing immigration policy and getting it passed, as is the example of Arizona. And we have generally just well-meaning people being okay with that. And actually the more and the more and the more that it goes on, not thinking there's anything wrong with that.
Right. Or at least accepting enough of the basic premise that it is a criminal justice issue.
Right. And, just even that you can't have a discussion about what does it mean to be illegal as a person, and not in like open all the borders, but, it just gets it's so polarized, so if you want to talk about the shades of grey in there, you can't, because you're either like a bleeding heart liberal open borders person or you're a crazy white supremacist extremist who doesn't want anybody here.
So when you talk about it's going to take a generation, what's the work that you can envision that could, what are the kind of incremental steps that need to be taken?
I think we need to learn lessons from the right, and I think it's not enough to just rely on the goodness of people and that they'll come to it. What the right did to get us to this position was literally have a strategic plan, like a 20-year plan. And they said, let's infiltrate all levels. Let's infiltrate Congress, the judiciary. Let's make sure we like have these like astroturf groups. Like let's get to the big who holds power in this society. Let's like big environmental groups. Let's infiltrate those and make immigration an issue in those. It was really well thought out. When you look at these plans and you look at the fact that it actually happened, and some of my research actually tracked the ways in which just regular staff people of these kind of really right-wing immigration groups were being put up to work for members of Congress. They were in their offices, they were writing legislation. Like, I think the left needs to do the same thing, like to get it back to a place, because it needs to happen in the public debate. And so our lawmakers need to be saying it passionately and believing it, and so it can't be a fringe thing. Right? And we can organize for change, and we should, and all the change we want is really, there are so many community organizations that are immigrant-based, that are led by immigrants, that have great proposals, great solutions to get us out of this. We need to listen to them. And if folks can start to get into places of power, that's one way of changing it. It's not the only way, clearly, but that's one way of starting to... Because right now, you can't get elected unless you're, quote-unquote, like, tough on immigration. You just can't get elected. Like, how does that change? Like, you have to come out and say, even in New York City, right, a place that's majority immigrants, to get elected, you're talking tough on immigration. where is the politician who's going to say, end moratorium on deportations, end all deportations now until we can have a thorough examination of this system to see whether it's working, for who it's working, what are the legal underpinnings of this? How does this fit in with international law? How does this... So,
right, and what are the economics of it?
and what are the economics of it? Well, I think Arizona is going to show really clearly what the economics of it are when people leave that place en masse because it's not safe to be there as an immigrant, documented or not documented. That state is going to feel the pinch.
Right.
And that means quality of education is going to go down, quality of hospitals are going to go down. It's always the greatest evidence in response to all the anti-immigrant haters who perpetually put out this lie that that undocumented immigrants are taking services comes from the comptroller of Texas, which is a border state, which a few years ago put out a report that was absolutely stunning. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was in the billions. Maybe it was 1.7 billion or something like that. That the state of Texas nets from its undocumented immigrant population. So if all those people left, they would be $1.7 billion worse off, right? And that's because most people believe they don't pay taxes, which they do. You can have and because the government wants you to pay taxes, and you need a social security number to get a job. There's a tax number called an ITN, an individual taxpayer number. Many undocumented folks have that.
Right, and then they, of course, never make claims.
And they never make claims,
so,
right. And they are also paying a hell of a lot of sales tax. And, so there's many ways in which immigrants are contributing that it goes uncounted, and that's just one piece of evidence to actually show.
So for a culture that's so addicted to the bottom line, how is it that our politics doesn't reflect these really cold economic realities?
I think that's not an easy question to answer, because I think we're an incredibly complex people, and we are easily swayed by. I think that there's a real need to belong, and if you can belong, if you can bond with somebody over something, even if it's xenophobic, but that brings you closer to somebody else who you can then be part of a community with, I think there's something powerful in that. And when, especially in hard economic times, you need community, and so I think you lose sight of your, I think that's one way of that I understand it, and I think another way is that this is a credit society. Like, everybody here lives. I don't think there's really now more so because people have been hit hard, but you can have a very low income and have a lot of material goods, expensive material goods, and so I think there's also a somewhat a false sense of what is that economic bottom line, which has changed a lot in the last few years.
And where one's so-called natural allegiances would fall. Right.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I still think, though, it's kind of like the way the healthcare debate unfolded, where I just felt like, if there were real leaders out there on the left of things, wouldn't every Texan know about this $1.7 billion? Wouldn't that be part of the equation that was at least part of the discussion?
And I think that's where information is so crucial, and how do we get information? It's through the media, and don't quote me on that 1.7 billion, because that's not quite it, but it's somewhere there. But that's absolutely, and then just further to that point is that what that report also did was, so there's a group called FAIR, Federation of Americans for Immigration Reform, who are kind of the leaders in the anti-immigrant movement, and
have been for 20 years at least.
So John Tanton, the founder of that group, was actually one of the people who sat down and wrote these kind of the blueprint, that 20-year strategic plan for how you get from that kind of more enlightened period in the 80s to a place where you could have like their dream then was big. Their dream then was like, let's have all Americans say, believe, vote for the fact that immigrants need to be put in jail and then deported. Right? If you said that back in the 80s, people laughed at you, which is why I think we can dream big right now. We need to get to a place in 20 years where X, Y, and Z. But to get back to your question, so you have these really hardline groups who don't at all have any qualms in manipulating the truth. So when they put out reports, which FAIR does all the time, and they say illegal immigrants are costing the state this much, or there's this many, they count documented immigrants in their illegal immigrant count. How do they do that? It's because if you're in the country without any papers and you have a child here and that child is a citizen, well, actually, no, you're not documented, so we're not going to consider your child a citizen, even though the law and the country considers them a citizen. So if they're going to school, they become an illegal person in that school, which is just a patent lie. But journalists and the media are not doing their homework. They're not reading the fine print. They're just reporting FAIR's figures. Mm-hmm. So the information that's being put out, and in a time when, of course, journalism in this country is in crisis.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that too. I mean, there are at least two dimensions to it that are worth noting, in the context of what you're just saying. One is journalistic practices and the fact that we just aren't doing the homework, and so really the way reportage goes these days is you just report on what somebody said, mm-hmm. and if somebody else says something different, then you mm-hmm. report on what they said, but there's no kind of digging of the sort that used to be kind of normal. So that's one dimension of it. Not even really any
fact-checking.
Right.
Like digging would be great, but just
right.
cross-reference.
Right. So there's that. But then there's also something which, has just gotten worse and worse in the last 10, 15 years, which is the kind of little boutique realities that one can tune into. Mm-hmm. And so that there's not
That's a nice way of putting it.
There's not like a common anymore. I have the sense that, when you have 3 networks, you get protests in the streets of the sort we saw in the Vietnam era. When you have 500 networks, you get kind of what we see now, which is a really sporadic kind of mm-hmm. fragmented polity. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts. Maybe both as a journalist and some of the changes that you've seen, or some of the struggles that you've had in the work that you've done, but also as a citizen, kind of how you see the media landscape and its importance right now.
I think this is our moment, because the system itself has proven that it's not sustainable, and it's crashing and burning. With regards specifically to journalism, it is not sustainable to have a profit-driven model for news gathering and reporting, and there's many reasons for that, and there's many implications coming out of that. But I'll just cut to the chase and say that people who believe that the media, one of the roles of the media, I don't want to be so, I don't know if ideologically driven is the word, but just, I think the media is there to entertain us, and that's a fine reason to have media, but I think a very important reason for media, and I've come to learn that after teaching in high school for 10 years and realizing that the reality of many people is that we do all enjoy pop culture, and we want it, so it's not a reality to say that the media should only be this. So there is a space right now for people who believe that the media has a public interest role, to put it politely, that information should be used to better our societies, our communities, and that we who are in the media should be putting forth information that help people better their own communities. That in sum is what I believe a large reason the media exists and should exist. And that can look so many different ways. There is no one way, and I think that's what's evolving and developing right now. But for those of us who have a kind of a public interest, a social change, a social good aspect for media making, right now is our moment. And I feel like it's our moment because the non-profit model is on the rise, even though it's being touted as this brand new new hot thing. It's really not new or hot. It's been around for a very long time. Which was what I was so inspired by when I first came to America. And I went to WBAI and was like, whoa, like millions of people around the country can like each give whatever they can give, and you can have this media, this radio station. That's amazing. I've never seen anything like it. So everything from like listener supported or user supported media to user driven media, so that people are engaging with each other, and I think that is so it knocks kind of it, and I think there's room for all sorts of things, but I think it also means that we have to be very critical media consumers, at the same time, because room for a lot of things means that there's a lot out there that you need to like sift through and wade through and have rose-colored glasses on for some of, and I think that's the piece where we continue to communicate with each other, because we educate each other every day about ways in which we can be critical media consumers. And I think that includes everything from, the social media, like to being, as everybody here at People's Production House will tell you, I'm the least social media user out of everybody. Find Twitter kind of annoying. And like really like studying out of like, how is this impacting journalism, and is this really a part? And I think really the biggest piece is that everybody has eyes and ears and can tell a story, right? It doesn't mean we are all journalists, but it means we contribute to a larger telling of a story.
Right. The underside of that, though, is, there was this case, I'm sure there have been other cases like this, but the one that is on my mind, when it was the day of, or maybe the day after the healthcare reform vote, when those Congress people were kind of assaulted on their way out of the building, and because it wasn't captured on YouTube, the charge is being made that with plausibility in some quarters, that it never happened. In other words, if it's not on YouTube, it's not real. And I think that's a very kind of scary underside to what goes along with the kind of democratization of information that we've seen, which is so exciting and really powerful in certain ways.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely one concern. I think another concern is people with power will still have more access. Like, I think that to me is the bigger issue of like, we can like all wonderfully proclaim that now, yes, that we can all be part of this, and we all have, we now have much more equal access, when the reality is that's not true, and if so even this recent federal court decision to not allow the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to rule on Comcast, and which is essentially a blow to people who believe in net neutrality, and you can throw around terms, and most people might not even know what net neutrality means, but that is huge for the way we communicate, because that means that it is allowing a big telecommunications company like Comcast, and of course then all the others, to say, oh, hey, New York Times, if you pay me this premium rate, I'll make your speed so much quicker. And then, oh, that little WBAI or People's Production House, they can never afford to pay that, so you don't even have to worry about it. People are going to come to your, not that they're saying that directly, they don't even need to say that.
Right.
And
that will just be the reality.
That will be the reality, and I don't think that's hit home in a big way. And that has the potential to impact us, I think, even more so than media conglomeration did. Because it's like, who is going to sit trying to get onto a website that waiting for the page to change, waiting. This is literally what it's going to be, waiting. Page still hasn't changed. Now, if I was on another site like CNN or the New York Times, bam, 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 my page is changing. Which are you going to do? Right? So now who has access to getting out the information? So, and I don't, it's not only just, and I don't mean this as like I'm not even so much worried about the New York Times and CNN. It's the very powerful groups who in the sense of what John Tanton and his extremists did in infiltrating Congress and the judiciary, et cetera, and big environmental groups like the Sierra Club to say immigrants are bad for the environment, and all of a sudden you have the Sierra Club coming out because on their board of directors now and high up in this is immigrants are bad for the environment. Well, now if you're wealthy and you can do this, let's create AstroTurf media on the internet, and we can afford to pay way more. And let's do it through the guise of we're kind of apolitical, we're not these extremists, and let's mainstream these ideas because we're so much more powerful and we have more money. So I think that to me is the danger of it all. And if people aren't vigilant, I think I had said earlier, I think this is our moment. I think it's also our moment to be extremely vigilant.
Yeah. So what form does vigilance take in this context?
Really getting involved in media policy, like knowing what's going on, knowing what to ask of your elected officials, so that I think for me it's like community organizations across the country. This is going to affect what you do. Like you might organize around racial justice issues or housing issues or economic justice issues or the right to this or the right to that. You need to care about media policy. You need to care about things like net neutrality, because if you don't, your access to getting information out is you're going to be squashed. So not saying stop fighting for racial justice and stop fighting for economic justice and your really critical campaign that's going to stop, this slumlord coming in and doing blah, blah, blah with this city's collusion or whatever it is you're fighting for. Don't stop doing that. But keep two fingers in a media policy world, because it's going to have an impact on you. So I guess get active.
Yeah. How much has the media landscape changed in the time that you've been a practicing journalist? Have are the things that are so apparent today, have those been kind of creeping up on us for the last number of years, or how do you see it as a practitioner?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think when you're in the middle of it, you just adapt to what's thrown at you, rather than, I don't feel like in the years of doing it, maybe in the last couple of years where I've become more educated on media policy issues and realised that they really do affect our field as a practitioner, but also as a consumer of information. But prior to that, I think you just adapt, so you realize that you can't do certain things. An editor gives you an edit that makes you say, okay, well, I get where you're coming from. You hone your pitches to certain outlets because they only run this kind of stuff. So I think I think it's more like you just kind of survive inside of the system.
The structures that you find.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, I'm just really the last kind of couple years I've been able to be more actively critical of it.
Okay, we've talked about immigration politics in recent years. Let's talk about the bigger picture. I've been traveling all over the country talking to all different kinds of people, and there's a pretty broad consensus that this is a kind of extraordinary moment historically, although there's no agreement at all about what's extraordinary about it or what the phrase "this current moment" even means. But when I say that phrase to you, what do you think it means? I mean, what are the things that come to mind, and what's been your experience of this historical moment that we're in, whether you want to define it as kind of Obama and his administration, or some people have talked about it as post 9/11. I mean, there's different layers to it, but what's your sense of...
I mean, I think I have to start that question really personally, because I do think this moment is about Obama. My niece was born 24 hours before Obama accepted that he had won the election. And that was just like in the space of 24 hours, that was two of the most amazing things that had ever happened in my life. And then 2 weeks later, my daughter was born. And I think especially for those of us who kind of lived and worked in the Bush administration, which was a big global moment as well. I mean, globally, Australia had an incredibly right-wing, conservative, repressive government for many more years than the United States did. In Great Britain, even though it wasn't a conservative government, they just went along. The world was in a much more conservative place in terms of kind of like the wealthier nations, and then in terms of nations, of poorer nations, there was a move to the left, right? So you had this big juxtaposition happening, and clearly the people who were really feeling it, who were on the receiving end in poor countries around the world, were moving towards governments that were more socially based, that had social contracts with their people, that believed in those. But I think for the world, listening to Obama and seeing Obama and just kind of wanting to believe in this man, and then seeing him get elected was an absolutely incredible thing, and having spent most of my life in Australia, and of course many people all over the world love to hate Americans, or at least love to like poke fun at Americans, which is how I would say Australians do it. They, of course, all I could say to people when Obama was elected was this: there may be a lot of crazy people in this country, but could you ever see your country electing a non-white? Ever? And I think just to stop for a moment and see how powerful that is. Like, this country, which was rooted in slavery, elected a black man. So by no means, I don't think, can that be taken lightly.
Mm-hmm. Does it make you think anew about the character of the country, or did that moment, the election, or maybe even before that, but the moment that you thought and realized that Obama was going to become the president, did it make you kind of look backward across history and kind of see it differently? Or how did you experience that almost jarring transition from Bush to Obama?
I don't know. I don't think it caused me to look back. I think, on the one hand, I definitely was caught up in some euphoria. There was also the contrarian in me, which was like rolling my eyes and saying, yeah, great, now we've got a black president, everyone's going to say racism's over, and that's not even the half of it. So there was definitely the cynic in me who was just like, actually, I wish he hadn't won, because that sets all of our struggles back, because now that he's won, well, none of these other things are problems anymore. But I think the overwhelming feeling was like, oh my God, this country did it. I can't vote in this country. I'm not a citizen, so I don't have a say. But the fact that, I teach in public schools around the city. And so I can tell you that I've never seen such actively engaged young people at like 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade level. Just even on the I can do this front. Mm-hmm. I think if nothing else, if Obama achieves nothing in his presidency, what he did, what I saw of young people of color across this city in that whole campaign leading up to it is incredibly powerful. So I think, and just the fact that he's so smart, just thank you. We just need a smart president, I think the other part of me is just very cynical about American politics because it's so personality driven, and I'm not from Australia's not like that. Mm-hmm. And you don't vote for a person. You don't put all your hope. Everything goes into this one person. This one person's going to change the world. It's just not a part of what I believe is actually true. It's about a movement and a lot of people, and I think that's, for me, one of the biggest things that, the work is not getting somebody elected. The work is holding them and the people who you elect accountable for all the things that you need after it. So I think the quote unquote moment needs more active participation from all of us. I think if it's unfair to say, oh, well, Obama, he hasn't done this and he hasn't done this and he hasn't done this, because the reality is the system hasn't changed. Like, we might have this like wonderful orator who can manage to somehow speak to people who are ideologically opposed and make both of them say, this is the man. But the system hasn't changed that he's operating in, and I think healthcare is a great example of that. What really can, you get done inside without mass public organization? Participation in your government. And I think that's something that I'm not sure America at large gets. Like, we're very passive. We'll sit back and watch the commentators shoot it out on CNBC, but that doesn't really involve me. And I think that's where, when you look at many countries around the world, it's so different. People are active participants in their community, in their local community, in their bigger community, and I think that's really the disconnect here. Is that this moment could be amazing, but maybe it happened in the wrong country. Maybe it should have happened, I don't know, in like Venezuela, or just that way people would really hold you to your word, but not hold you to your word. They would be your people base. They would allow you to do what you say, because they would be there en masse to say, yeah, that's what we want. So I think for me, the moment is less about Obama, and it's more about the fact that we all need to understand that participation in our communities, to start with, whether that means being on the local board of your child's school, or going to a local meeting that's held with your community board, or just talking to other people who you see at the subway station at the same time every single morning, about what works and what doesn't work, and what you love and what you hate, and building that sense of community, starting there, and then saying, well, let's really work together to make sure that we make our local community into what we want it to be. Like that empowers the great orators and all the rhetoric out there. And without that, it is just that. It's just speechifying.
In other contexts, you've talked about increased participation. We talked about vigilance. We've talked about voice in different ways. Is it conceivable to you that Obama could get the kind of real support from a mass base that he needs to make good on the promise of that initial moment? Or is it just endemic in American politics that we're just going to sit back on our heels and wait for him to do something good, and kind of, be critical of him when he doesn't? Or, how do you see that?
There's the cynical answer, and there's the hopeful answer, and I guess that changes every moment, every day. I would want to hope that we could do that, and I think there are many good people working on that every day, so I don't all want to make it seem like there isn't, but I think, again, it's about, I think the people who are most comfortable are the least active, and they need to take the lead from people who have an active drive to participate. I need to participate because I need better housing, or because my child's school needs to be better, or because, so it, to me, it's almost, it's kind of reverse. It's like the people who are participating right now are the ones who traditionally always have participated, because they have to. They can't, they know. Their reality is that they can't rely on electing somebody and then just kicking back and watching them. But now more than ever, they need the support of people who traditionally don't get involved or don't get active. And I think that's and I think that's a critique that's hard to make, because it's kind of the middle class for a very generalized way of looking at it. It's an educated class. It's the people who want to sit back and critique, but they don't want to get active. And if it meant that you yourself have to get active, which is why I look at the huge movements for immigrant rights.
Mm-hmm.
Those are people who have everything to lose.
Right. Well, I mean, in that sense, do you think that the economic crisis could be a blessing in disguise in those terms? I mean, in kind of jarring people out of their complacency, creating a new kind of class-based or maybe not class-based, but at least political economy-based kind of understanding of the lay of the land.
I mean, I feel like the sad part is now we're being told that we're coming out of the economic crisis, and I don't see that as having happened. Maybe in very small, tiny little pockets here and there, but in a mass sense, no. So I feel like that moment's gone. The hardest moment of that economic crisis might have been the push for that. So if we're past the hardest moment, which doesn't mean it's not going to get harder.
Right, but yeah, maybe we aren't past the hardest moment.
Maybe we aren't.
What's your sense of that? I mean, as you kind of move about the city, what's your sense of, to put it this way, what has been your experience of the economic crisis?
I think we are coming out of it a little bit, because many of the folks who we work with, nannies and domestic workers, street vendors, day labourers, folks who are on the front lines of this crisis. The Bear Stearns employee loses his job, the first thing he does is lay off his nanny. I think we're in a slightly better place. I don't want to say we're coming out of it, but we're in a slightly better place than we were, because folks who I know who have been out of work are finding work. So there's slightly more work for day labourers now. The wait on that corner is not weeks. Now it might be a little less.
Mm-hmm.
Domestic workers, it's still very hard to find a job, but it's slowly getting better. And this is all anecdotal.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done any studies. I think people got very creative, and maybe a little bit of that is paying off. I don't know. It's hard to really tell. Besides kind of those little indicators, young people who come through our programs. For a couple of years there was absolutely no summer employment, and now it's like some of them are getting jobs. Not great jobs, but they're getting jobs. And there was a period when nobody had work. So I think just anecdotally that way, it feels like things must be a little bit better.
It's hard to gauge. I mean, I've talked about this with other people too, that there weren't any really massive public markers of the crisis anyway. Like, you could read about statistics in the paper, but as you said, the credit society, even poor people look pretty good. Right. So it's really hard to tell, and there are no, you don't see the kind of scale of the crisis out there in a public way. So it's very hard to perceive.
I mean, I think the one other market just didn't, like New York City is such a commercial city. I mean, much less, like everything for a while there was just like 2 for 1, huge sales, like everything was on sale, 90% off. And now you really don't see that so much anymore.
Although you still see the vacant store fronts.
Yeah.
Tons and tons and tons of them. I don't know if they're coming back.
Yeah.
That I don't know about. Well, one more thing I wanted to ask you about was just and this in a sense maybe brings us back to Arizona, but the opposition to Obama. Have you been surprised by anything you've seen on
I'm surprised he's still alive. No, I don't. I mean, this country has a horrible history. It's like, I think I know a number of people who literally were very scared for him when he got elected, for his own personal safety and that of his families. No, I mean, I think I think the opposition. I'll admit to you that throughout the healthcare debate, it just baffled me. It absolutely baffled. And I've covered politics in this country for 10 years. And I just could not understand, like, I couldn't find, as a thinking person, and I still can't, in my head, understand that. I would go to my partner and I would say, can you explain this to me? I just don't understand how this argument can hold water. Like, how is it taken seriously by people? I mean, yeah, they passionately believe it, but how does it even make it onto a newscast as a serious argument? Because it just, like, that is one of the first places where it's like, wow, this is such an issue. Like this is so deep, because it's real simple. Really, right? It's just like, everybody needs healthcare. What you're arguing against is that people don't get to have healthcare. Maybe, and I feel like, of course, I'm tainted because I grew up in a place where there was socialized healthcare, but there's not even an ideological issue, right? It shouldn't be. Yes, I get you don't want government in this, so that becomes an ideological issue for you. But how? How is there any sentido, sense to what this opposition is saying that can't just be carved to bits and pieces by a proactive Obama administration? Just being like, well, you can go ahead and vote for them, who clearly want to deny you of all of this. And then it gets turned into death panels and all these kinds of things. You know, it's just like, wow. Like, this really is beyond sensical. And yet it is being reported like it is completely sensical. Like, it makes it's absolutely the way, you know, there's this side and then there's this side. And I think for me that says more about not the opposition to Obama, but the neutral and the supporters of Obama. That the rest of everybody couldn't shut that down. Just without, like, just with kind of like, what are you people talking about? Okay, go over there and have your little conversation while we serious people over here figure out how to get real health care to everybody. And that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. They actually were really serious players in this, and taken really serious by everybody from the president down. So that to me is just like, okay, you know, that's where the rest of the world laughs at America.
Right. Do you think Obama's getting better at this in terms of playing that game against that opposition?
I want to say yes, but I think it's like, I look at what he's doing on immigration and he's not. And I don't know. I think again, but I just come back to it, and I don't think it can be about one person. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's just like, even if he was amazing on it, I think it's about more of a mass outcry against those people. Then Obama can stand up. I mean, clearly Obama, he's a smart man. He knows that they're stupid, and that he needs to get them out of the way to get done what he needs to get done. But the only way he can do that is if everybody who voted for him, or everybody who believes in the kinds of things that he was saying on the campaign trail, actually gets active. Mm-hmm. So right now you have a small group of people who are active, and they're always the people who are active. Mm-hmm. He needs to be able to stand on top of his base, not have his base look to him and hope he does something.
Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel like we should have?
You covered a lot. That's
well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Wide-ranging.